The Board of Trustees of the American Water Works Association, New Jersey section, and I welcome you to the 10th edition of the Living History Project. I am Neil Goldfine, and I currently serve as the chair of the Retired Professionals Committee and have been involved with the committee and the New Jersey section for many years. This year marks the 10th year of producing this project. For those of you who are not familiar with the Living History Project, the project is a documentary series where retired industry professionals have a one-on-one conversation about the water industry and their experiences. They share with us the stories and their viewpoints on the section and how changes in state and federal regulations, technology, and social issues have changed the landscape of our profession. The main goal is to record and document the history of our section and the water industry of New Jersey. However, we hope that we will realize two additional benefits. The first is to encourage high school seniors, college students, and others to choose a career in the exciting and rewarding water industry. The second is to give young professionals in the industry a global perspective of the how, when, where, who, and why we are where we are today. In celebration of our 10th edition, I'd like to point out a few interesting facts about our past interviewees. We have had 24 first-hand interviews and 3 interviews that were done on behalf of a water utility professional who is no longer with us. The interviewees include water industry executives from private and public utilities, service providers, regulators, and educators. The careers of a few of our interviewees have crossed between private and public utilities and between utilities, service providers, regulators, and educators. The average length of service for our interviewees, is 41 years, and a number of our interviewees who retired from their full-time positions continue to participate in the industry either through volunteer efforts, knowledge-sharing efforts, or project work. A number of our interviewees have also proudly served our country. Each of our interviewees has had a distinguished career in the water utility industry. Without the interviewees' commitment to their career and to this project, we would not have been able to complete this project. And before we begin this year's interviews, here are a few more facts about the project. Originally, the series could only be viewed at the section's annual conference or upon request. Now, through the section's YouTube channel, many of our interviews can be seen on the internet. In 2013, the Living History Project received the AWWA Education Award. For many years, this project was recorded at various high schools using their audiovisual department's resources. In return, the schools received an honorarium from the section and an opportunity for the students to hone their craft. For a few years, when the schools were not available, we had the help of one of our service providers. And now, on to our interviews. Welcome to the 10th edition of the Living History Project. Join me in welcoming Rich Russo. Rich is over 40 years in the water industry. After graduating with a bachelor's degree in engineering from Villanova University, he began his water industry career in 1972 at the Trenton Water Works, the largest municipally owned water utility in New Jersey. He was responsible for budget preparations, operations, planning, engineering, and construction for the utility, serving about 220,000 people in the city of Trenton and parts of the 4 surrounding municipalities. His responsibilities also included working with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities. He moved from the public sector to the private sector, where he continued his career at the Middlesex Water Company. While at Middlesex, he served in various positions, including Vice President of Operations and Executive Vice President. He also had similar positions in Middlesex Water Company's subsidiaries in New Jersey and Delaware. At Middlesex Water Company, he directed a workforce of approximately 120 individuals in engineering, water treatment, pumping, and distribution of about 45 million gallons a day. He also directed the work of consultants in planning, engineering, and construction of capital projects, including treatment plants, production wells, and large-diameter water transmission mains valued at over $80 million. He directed the preparation of operating budgets and testified in rate case proceedings in both New Jersey and Delaware as to the necessity and of the in-service dates of capital projects. Rich continued his career at Mott MacDonald as the Vice President. He was responsible for marketing and new business development to utilities for various water and wastewater projects. Rich has been active in professional organizations in the water industry at both the local and national levels. He is a past chair and past international director of the American Water Works Association New Jersey section. He has also served on the board of the AWWA Research Foundation and holds a position on the State of New Jersey Water and Wastewater Licensing Board, as well as other notable water and wastewater organizations. He holds T4 and W4 New Jersey water operator licenses and is a licensed professional engineer in the state of New Jersey. He is a George Warren Fuller Award recipient. Let's welcome Rich Russo. Rich, how are you?
Fine, Neil. How you doing?
Just fine. How did you become involved or get your start in the water industry?
Well, Neil, to be perfectly honest with you, it was an accident. Literally. I was working for the City of Trenton as superintendent of the Streets Division of the Department of Public Works. The largest division of the Department of Public Works was the Trenton Water Utility, as you described in your introduction. Not only served 25,000 customers in the City of Trenton, but another 25,000 outside the City of Trenton, for which it was regulated by the Board of Public Utilities. In 1974, in September, there was an accident at the treatment plant, and it brings to the front the fact that the treatment plant was a sole source. Interconnections were not significant. So the Trenton water system was shut down for 7 days. My boss was the director of Public Works. His name was Joseph DeSillo, and he was like a second father to me. As a result of this accident, it was realized that the hierarchy of the utility was aging. So I got assigned to be the assistant general superintendent, and that's how I got in the water business.
And since I was living in Trenton in 1974, I guess I have your predecessor to blame, or you to thank for fixing it when I was out of water.
It wasn't that simple. There was really no one to blame. And I think this is another thing that still exists to a lesser extent, but this accident sensitized. There was an excellent report written about the accident, not to blame anybody, but what happened and how could we prevent it from happening again. And one of the things it said was the Trenton Water Utility was systematically underfinanced. It was a case of an accident, just waiting to happen. So I was fortunate to be involved, and my boss, Mr. Klockner, who also adopted me, was there for 5 years, and I slowly took over control and then brought in a next generation of people. Some names you might recognize. Joe Bella is now the head of Passaic Valley Water Commission. Brent Cacalori, a boyhood friend of mine, an assistant, he was living history last year, I believe.
Yes.
Rick Rizaldi is now Vice President of Operations of the Middlesex Water Company, and Jack Lavarchek and Ed Rapsowitz had careers with AWWA. We were all young. We didn't always know what we were doing, but we learned. But I was fortunate to have those people around me, and that made a big difference.
You created quite a fertile ground for people in the water industry.
As it turns out, I did. We all went on.
There are not many public utilities that can list a group of names that have gone on to higher levels.
No, you're absolutely right. And one other thing about Trenton Water that I'd like to mention was in the late 70s, we realized that we had infrastructure problems. Now, we all hear about infrastructure today. The first winter I was there, one of the older guys said to me, I don't know how we're going to get through this winter between the dirty water and the main breaks. We had 600 miles of cast iron mains, most of which were tuberculated with an iron oxide. When the water got cold, it got abrasive. People opened the tap and they got rusty water, and they complained. And when we started the first rehabilitation project, which has been ongoing since that time, I said to Brent Cacalori, where should we start? And he said, throw a dart in a map of the system. Here we are.
Yeah, it's very interesting. What changes or circumstances most influenced you during your career in the industry?
I don't know if I understand the question, but as you pointed out in the introduction, I had 3 distinct careers, and they all came with their own challenges, and I had to react to those challenges. So I guess the changes in the industry that influenced me were the great changes in regulation, a demand for better service from the public, and trying to turn the industry into that, which I think a lot of other people have done.
It's very interesting that you've had a career that involved 3 different places, both the public and private sector in the water business, as well as with an engineering consulting firm. Could you talk a little bit about the differences and how it impacted you in your career or personally, sort of changing speeds?
Yes, and you're right. The first 2, the public utility sector and the private utility sector, are regulated monopolies, which means that you have an obligation to provide the service to customers who don't have a choice about where they get their water. You have an obligation to provide the service, to provide reliable service. You have an obligation to provide that service at the lowest possible cost. Now, the consulting business is a little different. There, you have to earn your wings every day. You have to acquire clients. You have to perform in order to keep those clients in a very competitive environment. So it was an eye-opener for me, because I had worked with consultants for 30 years in the industry, and then I became one. And I wish I could have gotten that education before I was in the water utility industry, because I might have been a little more understanding.
What level of understanding did you need?
Well, I was very demanding of consultants. In fact, the consultant who did a lot of work for me, Nick DiNiccolo, I knew he'd be at his desk every morning at 7 o'clock. And every morning at 7 o'clock, I called him to tell him everything that I thought was wrong with what he was doing. And this went on for 15 years. When I went to work for the forerunner of Mott MacDonald, Killam Associates, and of course Nick DiNiccolo was the president, so now I was working for him. And he described it as, he tortured me for 15 years, and now I'm torturing him, but I'm not sure I'm getting the best of it. So it's been an interesting ride.
Could you talk a little bit about your AWWA experience? As I noted before, you did a lot of things with AWWA, for which we thank you. But could you sort of talk about, why and your experience?
It started very early, because Lou Klockner, my boss at Trenton, was a past chair and past international director of AWWA. So the first thing he did when I came on board, and then Brent came on board right after that, is get us involved in AWWA. And we started at the information desk, where you got to meet everybody. And then, of course, I had mentors in AWWA that I acquired Hal Florence was one of them. Lou Klockner was another. There was Jerry McCabe, who worked for Middlesex Water Company as the distribution superintendent. And I got involved, as you described earlier, in committee work. And I worked myself up to the program committee chair. And then I was appointed to the board. And I was a trustee from 1985 to 89. And in 89, having gone through the chairs, I became the section chair. My next assignment with AWWA was with the research foundation that I got involved in because when I worked for Middlesex Water Company, my boss, Rich Tompkins, another mentor, was involved in NAWC, the National Association of Water Companies, which is an organization of the private water utilities. And they had a board seat on the Research Foundation. When he was chair of NAWC, he put me on the Research Foundation board, where I served from 1995 to 2001. It was a fascinating experience. After that, Bill Hutchinson asked me if I would be interested in being national director. He was national director. And you heard a story from Bill Hutchinson. I became national director, where I served from 2004 to 2007. I think my experience with AWWA was one of the most rewarding things in my life, to be part of the industry that I was, very fond of.
Well, it takes a special type of person because it's not part of your job.
Right.
It takes a lot of extra time, and it's good to hear that you get rewards back for doing, because it's really volunteer work and a lot of extra time.
It is volunteer work, but I think the reward is, and the benefit to your individual company, is seeing what others in the industry are doing, and bringing that knowledge back to your own utility company. I think that's a great benefit of AWWA.
Yes, it is. How did the overall business climate change during your career? And we talked a little about regulations, but there's also, you were involved in rate making, and there's a whole different piece when we talk just about, beside the engineering and water quality, talk about business.
I think the challenge in business is in raising money for needed capital improvement projects. Out of all the utility industries, telephone, gas, the most capital intensive, the most money invested per customer is, of course, wastewater. And wastewater is largely in the hands of government. Following that is water. And, of course, a water system is pressurized, and that comes with certain challenges. Wastewater systems oftentimes aren't. So water systems wear out faster. And it's not always an emergency. And we don't want to live from emergency to emergency. In order to prevent that, money has to be spent. Then someone says, why are we spending these millions and millions of dollars? I turned the faucet on this morning, came out, was good. So the challenge became, as the infrastructure aged, and a lot of infrastructure has aged, a lot of cast iron pipe has aged and needs to be replaced or relined. There are various methods of rehabilitation. And I think the challenge in meeting that investment and doing it in some methodical way is the challenge in the industry, both public and private. The privates might have a advantage in raising money, but they have to go through a rate-making process. And the publics, I think, have a bigger challenge because the city council, whose responsibility is not only the water utility, but serves the general needs of the public, says, well, we spending all this money on this water utility. So I think they're the challenges that face the industry today, and of course attracting people to work in the industry. I sit on the Board of Examiners, and I believe the statistic is correct that there are only 70 or 80 people in the state of New Jersey who hold both T4 and W4 licenses. A lot of people are retiring, and we need licensed operators. That's another challenge facing the industry.
Are there things that can be done to sort of correct that? And yeah, actually, I know the statistics, you're only passing about one person a year.
No.
It's gone up?
No. There are a lot more. But statutorily, there are required times to be spent in the next lowest grade before you're qualified to sit for an exam for the next highest license. And we have 1s through 4s, 4 being the highest. One of the things that we're looking at is compressing those time periods so that people will be eligible to sit for the tests more often. The pass rate is, the higher licenses, I think it's about half. That might be a fair number.
Even for the T4s?
Oh yeah, and the Ws. But the biggest obstacle, I think, is the time that has to be spent in the lower class before you're qualified to sit for the higher class. And somehow we have to make that process a little quicker.
What about inspiring people to come into the industry? Has there been an issue with that?
Well, I don't know if there's an issue, but people sort of find their way into the industry, and then another thing that happens is oftentimes people from the public sector are hired by the private sector, who has a little more flexibility. I went from the public sector to the private sector. There was opportunity, and it's an opportunity I couldn't refuse. And I think that to some extent, that still exists.
Good. What advice would you have for people just starting their careers in the water industry?
Well, one of the advice, two things I would advise. One is, let's get licensed. Let's get in the program and start getting licensed. And then I think involvement in AWWA is a career builder. Those two things I would advise any young person going in the industry, regardless of their education or where they start.
Do you have any specific important memory of your career that you'd like to highlight and share with us?
I have memories. Not all of them are good, but for the most part, I think the most humbling experience was the Fuller Award, to be recognized by your peers as having accomplished something, given something to the industry. I remember the development of the capital program at Trenton, and I've lived to see it. And I think at this point in time, there might be those who disagree, but the Trenton water system is one of the best maintained water systems in the state of New Jersey. because they stood with the capital program. Not me, but my successors carried it on. I think my experience with the Middlesex Water Company in New Jersey and in Delaware, I particularly liked the construction of the South River Basin Pipeline, where the Middlesex Water Company went into areas that were cut back from groundwater in the 80s and brought water to those areas. And the large renovation of the Carl J. Olson treatment plant were things I remember.
Where is that treatment plant?
That treatment plant is in Edison.
Oh.
And that treatment plant treats, well, an average of 35 or 40 million gallons a day that comes through the Delaware and Raritan Canal. So this water comes from the Delaware River north of Lambertville, travels through 56 miles of a canal to where it almost empties into the Raritan River, and before that, the Middlesex Water Company picks it up, transmits it through a raw water pipeline, and processes it, and ships it to their 50-some thousand customers in Edison and Woodbridge, Central Jersey area.
That's very interesting.
The other thing I remember, and I fondly, mostly, was the development of Tidewater Utilities, which was the little 3,500 customer system that we bought in southern Delaware, which now has almost 40,000 customers.
That's very, very nice growth.
Yeah, it's nice to have lived long enough to see that.
Could you talk a little bit about how you balanced your work life and your home life?
I was fortunate. For the first 18 years, our children were growing up, and I worked for the city of Trenton. I was home every night. And when I worked for Middlesex, I commuted, but I was still home every night. By the time I got to the consulting business, where I couldn't be home every night, they were grown. So I didn't have much of a problem balancing my life. My wife had both feet on the ground, and we spent our weekends with the kids when they were growing up, and life went on. It went on a little quickly, looking back, but it went on.
Well, that's very good. Well, Rich, I want to thank you for participating in this program. It's been very interesting hearing your stories and getting your perspective. I'd like to thank you.
Thank you, Neil.
Let's welcome William Hutchinson. Bill has both a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in civil engineering from the New Jersey Institute of Technology. He's a licensed professional engineer in New Jersey. He also holds T4 and W4 water operator licenses in the state. He was employed for 28 years by the Southeast Morris County Municipal Utilities Authority. For the first 16 years, he was the authority's superintendent / chief engineer, where he's responsible for system operation, budgeting, contacts, construction, engineering, planning, permitting, operations, personnel, maintenance, and capital improvements. That's an awful lot of stuff to do for one guy. For the last 10 years at the authority, he served as the executive director / chief engineer. His responsibilities included duties associated with the chief executive of the authority, assistant treasurer, and licensed engineer. He is a past chair of the New Jersey section of the American Waterworks Association, past international director, and a George Warren Fuller Award recipient. He continues to serve as a public sector water utility representative on the New Jersey State Water Supply Advisory Council. This position is appointed by the governor. He is currently employed part-time by the Township of Morris as an engineering inspector. He has also committed his time to the benefit of the water industry and the community, serving as chairman of the Madison Borough Environmental Commission, as a member of the Madison Borough Utility Advisory Committee, as an instructor to the Rutgers Cook College water course, serving on the Project Advisory Committee for an AWWA Research Foundation project, and making numerous presentations at the Association of Environmental Authorities and AWWA New Jersey section conferences and workshops. Bill is also a master woodworker.
I didn't know you were going to read the whole thing.
How are you, Bill?
All right, doing good now.
Good. I'm going to ask you a few questions here.
All right.
How did you get involved, or how did you get started in the water industry?
Well, I actually started out in the wastewater end. I did then take a job for Public Works Director at Pequannock Township. And the water utility was under the jurisdiction of Public Works in Pequannock. And I really got into it because the water system needed a lot of improvements, a lot of work, and we got a lot of support to do that. So, you know, it was really fun to do the water supply work. So after that, I kind of wanted to stay in the industry.
What circumstances influenced you most during your career?
Well, I guess the circumstances are, like I said, the support that I got from councils and boards that I worked with, the managers I worked under. I think those are the biggest circumstances that influenced me.
Any particular people that you feel mentored you or helped you in your career?
Well, in my career, yeah. Like I mentioned, the managers I worked for, Harry Gherkin being the most prominent, another guy, Dave Ferguson in Pequannock Township, and an early manager I had, Paul Gleason. In the AWWA New Jersey section, I had a lot of people that helped me and mentored me. There was Ben Lentz, some guy named Rich Russo, Ed Mullen, John Dykeson. And there's also a Jewish guy from Atlantic City, Neil Goldfine, that's it.
I've heard of him. I know his wife. What was the regulatory climate like during your career?
Well, when I started out, the Safe Drinking Water Act was still new. So, you know, we were dealing with that as the regulations were coming down kind of fast and furious. That's not to say that it's a bad thing, but we were lucky with the safe drinking water people at DEP. They were easier to work with. For the other regulations like wetlands, pollutant discharge, I found that to normally be a hindrance. I mean, they seemed to be unmoving, a lot stricter with, you know, interpreting the regulations.
Did you talk a little bit about your AWWA experience? I know you volunteered a lot and did a lot of things for AWWA.
Well, I mean, you covered most of the highlights of my experience in AWWA, but I guess it started out early on when I took the job in Pequannock, and I saw that they were members of AWWA. So I went to one of the conferences. I didn't really take it that serious at the time, but I did go to the banquet. And if you recall, at the time, the banquet, all the trustees had to sit at this head table, and they had their tuxes on, and you know, they were sort of elevated above the rest of the attendees. But you know, they were the captains of the water industry in New Jersey, and I thought to myself, you know, this is pretty cool. I think, you know, one of these days I'll want to be up there in a tuxedo. So that's how it got started. So, you know, it's like the way it always works. You get on a committee, and you do the committee work, and, you know, hopefully you get to be a trustee, which I did, and eventual chair. And then I was also lucky at the time to be appointed as national director.
Talk a little bit about your experience as a national director. I mean, you're flying all over the country to do things.
Well, it's a great experience. It really is. The work for national is minimal. I mean, if you can sit in one room for 6 hours and learn how to say "I," you're probably qualified. The work as national director is really in the section, You're on the trustees, so you have to participate in, the liaison to committees, etc. So that's where the real nitty-gritty of being national director comes in.
How did the business change? I mean, the water business, I know you primarily worked in the public sector, but you still observed a lot of changes, especially pressures from the private sector in different areas. How did that business climate change during your career?
Well, the business climate at municipality was a lot different than at the authority. We did not have as strict budgeting rules and funding rules. So it was easier at the public authority to do your capital improvements, get things done, and without all the red tape. But the changes that you're talking about, the huge thing over the course of my career is the digital age. I mean, when we first started out, everything was analog. I mean, you had charts on the walls, and you had piles of them piled up in the closets. Didn't even have an electric typewriter at the time. So the digital revolution is probably the biggest change. I think it's a mixed blessing, though. I mean, it really allows you to collect and handle and massage your data a lot easier. Things do go faster for the most part, but as 9/11 taught us, you're putting everything, all your information, all your operations information on some server somewhere or in the cloud. So, I think you're a lot less secure with, everything digital and on computers.
Are any particular projects that you worked on at Southeast Morris that you're particularly proud of or were really excited about?
Well, I guess the biggest one was rebuilding the Clyde Potts treatment plant. We have a small reservoir. It's in Mendham Township. It was an old direct filtration plant, and we upgraded it to a membrane plant. So that was a big accomplishment because we tore everything down from the old plant and built it from scratch. So it was innovative at the time. It was an exciting project. So that's really the main one. I'm also proud of the water source project, where we were able to bring in tandem with New Jersey American Water. We were able to bring 25 million gallons a day of water into Morris County from Passaic Valley Water Commission. So those are the two really big ones. There were a lot of construction projects we did at Southeast, so it was a fun time.
How large is the Southeast Morris County MUA? I mean, as far as water supply and numbers of people?
It's about 65,000 population. That population increases during the daytime because of a lot of office buildings. And they average about 8 MGD.
What advice would you have for those just starting their careers in the water industry?
For just starting their careers, well, I guess the best thing to do is join AWWA and try to get involved. You get to meet, your peers from other utilities and other people that work in the industry. And that would be my advice. So take it from there. Learn all you can.
Okay. Looking back at your career, were there any mistakes that were made?
Yes.
You don't have to admit
I think
all
I
of them.
prefer not to get into that. We just don't have time.
Okay. How did you balance work and home life?
Well, in my case, it was pretty easy. I only had 2 kids, 9 years apart. I worked right near where I live, 20 minutes. I didn't have very many night meetings, and I didn't stay late that often. So it was not a problem at all.
Okay. What advice do you have for those that are rapidly approaching our category, who might retire soon, who are looking at a different horizon?
Well, I mean, it's the same advice that you get anywhere. You got to have a plan. You got to have something to keep you occupied, either a part-time job, some consulting work, or even a hobby. I think is a good thing to have. But you really need to have something that you're gonna do almost every day.
Okay. Well, it's been very interesting talking to you, Bill, and
Thank you, Neil.
I wish you a lot of luck, and thank you for doing this interview.
You're welcome.
Well, Bill, we've been around for a long time.
Yes.
I personally never thought we'd get to this point of being living history, but I suppose it's better than the alternative. And I think about our involvement in AWWA that goes pretty far back.
Yeah.
And I think about how AWWA has evolved from a good old boy organization.
Yeah.
How do you see that change? What's your take on that change? How would you describe it?
Well, I mean, it was the industry, you know, mostly engineers, and you know, at the time, not a lot of women went into engineering. You had the engineers were the top dogs at a lot of utilities instead of managers or financial people, and that's what it was. You know, you'd have these superintendents and the engineers mostly, and they were mostly men. I remember if you recall, how Florence would hold that court on Friday morning at the quote superintendent's breakfast.
Oh yeah,
and you had to be a superintendent to go to the breakfast.
absolutely.
Then it did get open to everyone, and you know, it's fine, but that's the way it was back then.
It was interesting to me that even though the captains of the industry, both the public sector and the private sector, were all involved in AWWA, but I don't believe there was a consulting engineer on the board of AWWA until the 90s. I think Peter Doe was the first one, and I remember the debate because the board was the province of those who ran the industry,
Yeah.
not necessarily those who serviced it, although there was always a vendor that was the secretary-treasurer. But the board itself did not contain any consultants until, I believe, the 90s.
Yeah, I think a lot of that goes back to you know, the financial problems that the municipalities have. You know, so a lot of the utility people didn't have the wherewithal to put in a lot of time and attend a lot of conferences.
Yes, that was a case in municipalities. The bigger cities usually were involved, and then there were the privates, and the private utility companies, which have a bigger base in New Jersey than most other states,
Right.
were always influential in the process. But I want to recall now, I was looking at my notes, and I was national director from 2004 to 2007.
Yeah, Rich came in right after me as national director, and there's a tradition at national when you know, there's a third of the directors come in every year, so that, you know, every year you have new directors coming in at the national organization. So, and the tradition is that the outgoing director introduces the incoming director. So I introduced Rich at it's at a breakfast. So, and I started out by saying, you know, introducing, this is Rich Russo, otherwise known as Clemenza. So it says, that doesn't mean he has anything to do with The Godfather, but he does work for a guy named Nicky Nork.
That was good, and I didn't get any rebuttal.
So they know him as Clemenza at the national organization.
Well, it was an interesting time, and I heard you describe what the national directors did, and you had to sit there for 6 hours and say yes.
Right.
But most of the work was with the sections.
But it was a lot of fun too. I mean, the travel was great. I mean, the
we saw a lot of
winter meetings. You know, we went to Scottsdale one year, Puerto Rico.
It was always
One year.
warm.
It was always supposed to be a warm.
I remember being
warm
in Puerto
place
Rico with you.
That's right.
You
You
invited me to come as I was coming in.
as you were coming in. Yeah,
Yeah, it was an interesting,
that was a good one.
good trip.
Yeah.
What do you think about the, again, a little bit about regulation and of course, environmental regulation? I recall when I came into the industry, I went into the lab in a large water plant, Trenton owned, and I was looking at the lab reports and I noticed that the turbidity of the delivered water was always 0. There wasn't one time when it wasn't 0. So I asked
right?
So I asked one of the lab guys, why is it that the turbidity of the delivered water is always 0? We must have had a bad day here and there. We treat a river. Oh no, we don't test it, they said. Everybody knows it's 0. We went from there to
50.
where we are now.
Yeah.
Where we are now.
Well, I think
change.
the regulation under the Safe Drinking Water Act is a good thing. All right, that's been really done a lot to improve the conditions of water supplies in the country. I was talking the hindrance with really the other laws that have extensive regulations. We try to build things, so you run into trouble with wetlands. All right, we have treatment plants that have to discharge.
The gypsies.
So you've got, the water pollution control issues, and I found that some of the agencies, not all of them, were really strict in interpretation of the regulations, and didn't work with you very well.
In the 70s, the Trenton Waterworks, typical of a large river water treatment plant, discharged the residuals back into the river.
Yeah.
Most of it was turbidity that was removed from the river. When the gypsies came in, the EPA said, you can't discharge a waste product of more than 40 parts per million. We, of course, were in violation, but we contended that we took it from the river, unlike other industries, which just put it in the river.
Well, they don't buy that anymore. So
No,
I don't know. What did you do?
There's a large mechanical dewatering facility there.
Okay, so you
Yeah.
wound up putting in
We
dewatering.
did. We put in dewatering, and the discharge now meets the standards, which I guess in retrospect is the right thing to do.
We had a similar situation with the membrane plant, that we were able to the constant flow in the membrane tank, so we were able to discharge back to the reservoir.
Yeah, which is nice.
Yeah.
Well,
It was nice talking to you again.
same here. Good seeing you, Bill.
All right.
Take care.
You too.